about to enjoy an experience in extreme terror. I'm alive. Can't you hear me? I'm alive, alive, alive. Someone help me.
There's no time.
The time is
13
o'clock. Hey you guys, it's episode 107.
Yeah, what's this one about?
We're actually doing a topic that I've been wanting to do for a long time, and it's been requested a couple of times.
Yeah, I remember.
We are doing a whole cemetery theme.
Yeah.
Premature burial and body snatchers.
Buried alive.
Yeah, I love this shit.
Yeah, when I was a kid, I always had like kind of like this irrational fear of being buried alive. I think I saw it happen in a horror movie one time, and it was like, man, what if you woke up and you were in a casket?
I think that's a pretty universal fear.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest with you, and Edgar Allan Poe put it in a bunch of his stories, so obviously it was kind of a thing. And honestly,
that was a Victorian fear. They were worried about that.
They were, and actually, it's not a crazy fear. It does happen.
Especially back then.
And it does happen more. It's happened more recently, also, which is kind of upsetting.
I think I remember reading where one time or another somebody dug up some an old Roman coffin, late Roman period.
Yeah. And
had been torn up on the inside that the person had been buried alive and woke up. I don't know if that's a myth, but I remember hearing that.
Yeah, there's kind of a lot of stories along that line. It's like, I'm willing to concede that it's probably not as common as people might think, but I don't think it's all that uncommon either.
Right.
Or it's like way more common than I'm comfortable with.
Yeah. I remember it being a Roman coffin, and it's kind of setting off a little bit of a bullshit detector because Romans didn't bury each other. They usually cremated each other.
They did burials and cremations, but usually the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans would usually leave the bodies above ground for quite a while.
Make sure they were dead.
To make sure they were dead because, they didn't want that shit to happen.
Right.
And I'm kind of going to go into that a little bit in the history of premature burial because it's actually really fascinating.
You going to talk about all the premature burial prevention machines?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Well, and I was going to say where I got a lot of the information for the premature burial part of this show is from this book right here, which is called, I'm going to show it, which is called Buried Alive.
Yeah.
By Jan Bondesen. He is a doctor and a historian, and he is fascinated with the shit. And this book, I got it like at a secondhand bookstore or something like that. If you are of sort of a morbid turn of mind, as I am, this book is hella entertaining. I mean, seriously, I have read this book like several times, and it is so fun. I mean, it's horrifying.
Yeah.
But also kind of fun.
You should see Jenny's library. I mean, in the office, I have about half of it up. There's more than twice that upstairs in the attic in storage. I mean, she buys real books.
I've read.
Kind of annoying. Where are you going to put them all?
I have read every single one of them. Yeah, it's a pain in the ass when I move, but for some reason I've never switched over to Kindle. It's a good idea. Like I like the idea of Kindle. Like if you're traveling and stuff, and you can take a shit ton of books with you.
Right.
But if I'm going to read a book, I would rather read a real book.
Right.
Even though I read a lot of stuff online, it doesn't.
I'm kind of like that with movies. I like DVDs and Blu-rays. I don't like online content. I don't like to be dependent on an internet connection to watch something.
Yeah.
And then I feel like I actually have something that I can possess. It's in my hands. I'm like, I got it.
Yeah, I feel the same way about books. And it's like, I've probably spent, I'm sure I've spent thousands and thousands of dollars over the past many years of books. Usually I get them secondhand. I go to bookstore, or I go to Barnes & Noble used to have in the front. They used to have all those books for like $5 or $6, like big hardback ones. So I got a lot of those too. But yeah, I've got shit tons. I got all kind of stuff about fucking burial alive, different kind of poisons and how they work. It's like all that kind of shit. People whose corpses like were stolen and like ended up in different places and shit. I love that kind of shit. But so that's gonna be our topic. I'll probably talk about premature burials a little bit first, and then we'll do a little bit about body snatchers, so about Burke and Hare and
what kind of announcements
and stuff like that. Okay, so the announcements we have, as I said, I think I said this on the last show, that Faceless Villain Volume 2, the writing and mostly the editing is done.
Yeah.
So what I'm doing now, I'm about halfway through like the print layout, because you have to line everything up, and just I'm doing one more read through to make sure there's no mistakes, and then I have to do an index, and then after that I'll be done. So probably in a couple of weeks, the print version and the ebook version will be up, and then hopefully over the next week I'm gonna start recording the audiobook version,
and then that's got to pass. That's got to pass quality control. Yeah. Usually, it might take an additional 2 or 3 weeks before an audiobook actually goes up for sale.
Yeah, the quality control, because you have to have. I'm not sure if you guys know how this works, but you have to have the print version at least up before you can even put up the audio version, because it has to link it to an already existing work, and then it has to go through their quality control, which usually takes 10 to 14 days.
Yeah.
So it generally takes about 2 weeks.
We'll be able to hand out free audiobooks probably about a month.
Yeah,
maybe a week.
It's probably going to be, like I said, because I'm really like trying to get the print
Right.
version done. I'm going to upload that as soon as it's done, and then I'm going to just start recording it next week. We're recording this on Sunday, so this upcoming week, which is the week of Labor Day, I'm going to start recording the book. So that should be up shortly.
Audio quality will be better, of course, because we have a much better microphone now.
Yeah, and like I said, that's probably why I'm going to go back and re-record like some of my older stuff, and then re-record, and then actually record my fiction for the first time.
That's right. We've been Jenny and I have been discussing how this new fiction effort is going to go. This is going to be badass. You guys are going to like it.
Yeah, I mean, I hope so.
It's going to be a bunch of collections of stories, probably at least 3 books. Each one of them a collection of a bunch of stories.
Stories, novellas,
that were published in other compilations by other companies that she mostly didn't have the rights to actually sell on her own, but all that stuff's being freed up now. So this will save you a lot of money. You don't have to hunt down all these old collections that these companies put out. It'll be like a one-stop shop. You can get Jenny's work just directly from her.
Yeah, so if you're interested in reading my fiction, then that's something that's definitely going to be coming up. And obviously, the 3rd volume of Faceless Villain, I'm going to start working on that.
Yeah, and in case you guys have never read any of her fiction, I kind of think that Jenny is a lot like Clive Barker. To me, it's like a cross between Clive Barker and maybe some King kind of thrown into it, wouldn't you say?
Yeah,
it's pretty gross, but it's awesome. It's awesome. Some of it, she's
like I said, morbid.
Yeah, she's very morbid, and it's weird stuff, man. It's really weird stuff. Cannibalism and just zombieism and weird sexual stuff, and you guys will like it.
Yeah, like I said, I love it.
You'll like it.
That's why I've been looking forward to doing this particular show.
And in the past, it was hard to find because most of her little short stories ended up on these kind of obscure collections that kind of just got sent out into the ethosphere wherever they were, and now the copyrights have now gone back to you, so you can put it out on your own.
Yeah. Interestingly, one of the short stories that I wrote that was in a compilation several years ago called History is Dead. It was all historical zombie stories.
Yeah.
And my story that was in there was called The Anatomy Lesson, and it was actually about body snatcher type thing. It had Rembrandt in it. It was about his painting, which is called The Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Tulp, where they were cutting open and pulling out the little dude's musculature in his arm. And it was kind of from that point of view. So it actually kind of ties in with the topic of today's show. Which
what kind of sucked the way the old media used to be before, the way we do things now, of course. She'd write an awesome story and end up being in a collection. And in that collection of short stories, all those different authors would get like 5-star ratings. But it wasn't on her author page. It was on the page of that damn book. So when it comes to launching her own materials, I mean, she's only got like 1 or 2 reviews of the thing. So now we have control over her fiction.
Yeah,
and we can now build a fiction fan base based around Jenny Ashford. Now I'm thinking, I think like a salesman, and I know the product, I know the quality is very high, and I think that once we start repackaging and remarketing your material, it's gonna be a market success, I think, for you.
Yeah, I mean, this is something I've been wanting to do for a long time, just consolidating all my fiction, because I have so much of it laying around, and it's just like some of it was in other books, some of it I haven't published, and it's like, so I really want to get to a point where I can just put all of them together, like in one series of books, that kind of look like a set.
Yeah, it's gonna look like a set.
you know. So that's kind of what I'm going to do. After Faceless Villain 2 comes out, I'm going to get started on that and simultaneously be working on Faceless Villain Volume 3.
And Jenny has a good fan base for her nonfiction. And the nonfiction fan base is the launching platform for the new fiction, and it'll go over well.
Yeah. So you know, if you like horror fiction and you like some of my nonfiction,
we're gonna give you guys some free copies of it, and you guys can help her out by writing a review. Yeah.
And also, like we say every episode, if you'd like to financially support the show, you can go to our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/13o'clockpodcast, or you can go to our blog, which is 13o'clockpodcast.wordpress.com, and there's a link in the sidebar to a PayPal account. Now, this week, one of our heavy hitters on Patreon, Thomm, with an H. Yeah. Not like you. No. Has actually doubled his support.
Heard about it, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, he went from like what, $20 to $40?
Yes.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, man.
It's like that is awesome.
Yeah.
You know, like I said, any amount you can give is fine. If you want to give once through PayPal, that's fine too. You know, everything helps us. Right. You know, make the show better. And that's what we're trying to do. And like I said, when we get to $1,000 a month on Patreon,
we're going to start something new.
We're going to launch a third weekly show.
Yeah.
So,
which we've been bouncing some ideas around. By the time that happens, we'll know when we start getting close to that 1,000, and we'll start getting something in the can.
Yeah, yeah.
That way, you know, we'll test it out on some of our subscribers to see if they like it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, we have some good ideas for it. I think it's going to be fun.
Yeah.
But, you know, if you like the movie reviews, it's going to be almost kind of like a combination between like movie review type of thing and this type of thing, but like kind of more funny, I guess. Cause I know,
it's gonna be fun.
Because I know that like on the regular show, sometimes we do funny topics, and a lot of times we do super bummer topics.
Yeah.
Like
now I want this to be kind of positive and nostalgic. Yeah. We're going to talk about old stuff that used to exist and where, you know, what happened to it, why it made it or why it didn't make it. I want some good visuals. I want some good soundtracks in the back. I want some vaporwave playing sometimes. You know what I mean?
He loves the vaporwave.
Yeah, I love it. I love the vaporwave.
Yeah, so that's...
well, the music will have to just fit whatever the topic is.
Yeah, you know what I mean? Yeah. I'm not going to limit myself. I'm just going to I'm going to do each one as like a separate, like depending on whatever the topic at hand is.
Each one will be kind of like a one-off.
Yeah, yeah. That's definitely what I'm picturing.
Right.
So anyway, other than that, just the usual things. If you want to check out my game, which is a Giallo-type murder mystery. Somebody asked on YouTube if you had to know about the movies to play this game. You do not. It helps. It makes it funnier, I guess, if you know kind of a lot of the tropes. But you absolutely don't need to know anything about the Giallo genre. If you know how to play Clue, you can figure it out. It's a very similar to Clue, but also has an element of kind of a dungeon master director type person who like makes up a mystery and then everybody else solves it.
Is it for sale already?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so
it's at thegamecrafter.com. Okay. I usually put a link in the description.
Remind me, we got to send a hard copy of that to Beer and Board
Games, yeah.
And see how much money they want to fucking have a, you know what I mean, to make an episode about that.
Yeah, because
I'm assuming they charge money.
Well, you can
do that.
What you would do is you would send them a copy and you would sponsor an episode.
That's what I'm saying. Sponsor an episode.
Yeah.
I wonder how much they're talking.
Or buy them beers. I think that works as well.
What are we talking about? 100?
I'm not sure. I have to go look. I don't know offhand. I have to go look.
We got to contact them.
All right. So before we get into the premature burial portion, I just have a couple little news stories, and I wanted a couple little recent news stories that were cemetery related, so we could do a whole graveyard type of show. Which I kind of like the idea. So there aren't, I mean, not surprisingly, there aren't really that many graveyard-related news stories from the past couple weeks. But I did find a couple. And this one happened, they were like sometime between August 18th and August 27th in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Somebody went into the Forest Home Cemetery and stole a 6-foot bronze angel statue from off of the Schroeder family plot. And they also took these big, like 3-foot by 6-foot doors. And they're just like, this is heavy shit.
Yeah.
And this angel has been there. It's really pretty. Like, I'll put pictures of it in the video. But
somebody put that in their house.
Yeah, and I'm sitting there going, and one of the other plots nearby, because apparently there's a lot of these bronze angel statues that have been there for like, you know, decades over particular family plots, because it's like a pretty popular, you know, grave marker to put on there. And they've been there for a really long time. But for some reason, recently, somebody decided, I'm going to get that shit. and they drove into the cemetery.
Yeah.
How much does a fucking 6-foot angel? This is a big statue, and it's bronze. I don't know if it's solid, but it's probably hollow.
Probably hollow, yeah.
But I mean, you have to want that pretty bad.
Yeah.
Because that would necessitate a truck. I don't know how it's put into the ground. I don't know. You know what I mean? It's like, I don't know.
You would think it was a group effort. You'd probably need 3 or 4 guys to do it.
There's no way just one person
Just
could
makes
do
me
it.
wonder, you know, I can understand somebody wanting it maybe as a decoration in their house. But how do you talk 4 or 5 other guys to go, man, let's go get this thing and put it in my house? It wouldn't, which leads me to believe maybe they sold it. Because there'd have to be some kind of a monetary reward to motivate guys to go down there and steal it. And it was bronze, wasn't copper.
Yeah.
Okay. Because if it was solid copper, that'd be worth a lot. You just in copper itself, you could melt it down into ingots and sell it by the pound.
That's what I was thinking. But then it's like, why? I don't know. It just seems like a lot of trouble. And it's like, here's the thing too, though. If you want, and I'm not averse, I wouldn't mind having some cool like funerary statuary in the house, because that's pretty cool. But I'm not gonna go and steal it from a fucking graveyard. Go on Amazon or something. They have replicas of shit like that you can say you stole off a grave. If you really want to say that you stole and no one's gonna call you on it, it's fine. So I don't understand why you actually have to go to a graveyard and take somebody's grave marker when I don't know, it just, maybe it's because I'm lazy, but it just seems like too much trouble,
right?
Like, you know, for not much reward, unless somebody wanted that statue specifically and paid them a lot of money to go get it. I don't really know,
right?
But yeah, so they have no idea where the fuck these gates or this angel statue went, and so they have like all kind of, you know, phone numbers you can call and shit like that to figure out where this, because the family's kind of pissed.
When I was living in Detroit, I used to live at 2nd and West Hancock down in downtown Detroit. Lived there for about a year and a half. There was a little gothsters running around and punk rock kids, and you know, we were living in this basically an apocalyptic type situation. And some people had that kind of cool stuff, you know what I mean? They would grab a stained glass window out of a crumbling church somewhere, and they'd have that propped up in a corner of a house, and statues and gargoyles that came off of crumbling buildings. It's kind of cool. It looked like something out of The Crow.
Yeah, like, see, I would do that. Like,
but you're not stealing it from something that's being used.
Right,
it's
from somebody's burial plot.
It's basically ruins. You know.
Yeah, like
all that stuff's probably gone now. I mean, I saw on YouTube that they're tearing most of Detroit down. All the suburbs are gone pretty much. They just raised them to the ground. It's returned back to nature.
But I mean, you know, if the church is abandoned and no one's using it, it's like, I wouldn't be averse to going in there and taking a stained glass window. I'm not proud. But I'm not taking it off anybody's grave. That's, you know.
Right.
That is not classy. Not at all.
That's not right.
So this other cemetery story, this also happened in August. Now, this kind of amused me because the headline was something like, body found in cemetery. And you're like, yeah, no shit. But no, this was a body that actually wasn't supposed to be there, that they found in a cemetery in Santa Monica, Texas. Now, this guy, it didn't really say in the article what the cause of death was. I presume he was murdered, but they're not entirely sure who he is. They think that he might be this fella named William Bill Costello, who was last seen August the 1st at the Tiki Condominiums on South Padre Island in Texas. Now, this guy was either a priest or a former priest. Now, evidently, there was a little bit of a scandal about him because him and this other priest, there was like a lawsuit, like a defamation lawsuit, because one of them accused the other one of assault on one of the church students or something like that. And so there was a big lawsuit. And after this happened, like this guy who went missing, like he disappeared. So now they're kind of wondering if this dude that they found dead laying in this graveyard in Texas is him. So this
they can't ID him?
Well, they're working on it now. This was a very recent. I mean, this article was only from a couple days ago. Okay. So they're just assuming, well, this is a missing person that is, you know, is it only like 40, 50 miles away. So they're like, this is a missing person from this general area. And he looks about the same. He's like same description, you know, sort of elderly. He's, well, not elderly, but, you know, he's an older white male, 200 pounds, whatever. So they think that this might be this priest, which kind of leads me to maybe that other priest fucking bumped him off and then left him in this fucking cemetery. It's surprising to me how few bodies are found in cemeteries. You'd think if you were going to kill somebody, and then you could like dig a hole and then bury somebody under where they were already.
Well, there's usually a high fence around them, and there's gates.
True.
It's hard to get in there to get that body in there.
I guess
you
so.
can't just walk in. Or
Not anymore.
Or there may be an approach where you could walk in. You know, going back through my memory of all the little cemeteries used to play in up in Mississippi. There might be a way in, but that's the side that's covered in forest.
Yeah.
So that means you got to carry this body around everywhere, and you don't know the ages of the people involved. It might have been killed by another guy who's not real physically fit, you know. So
yeah,
you
true.
can't carry him.
Yeah. All right. So we'll kind of keep up with that and see if that actually does end up being that priest, and if it was the other priest that the lawsuit was about that actually ended up killing him and dumping him in the cemetery. So let's see. Where are we at time? All right, so that'll do it for the news stories. We kind of kept it a little bit shorter than usual.
Yeah.
But we're going to take a little bit of a commercial break right now. And then when we come back, we are going to talk about premature burial and body snatchers.
Yeah.
So we'll be back in just a few minutes.
Shirt designs up, 4 of them, really good ones too. Atlanta Ripper, Who Put Bella in the Witch Elm, the H.H. Holmes Murder Castle, and of course Demon Child, because man said he could. These are updated designs. I think they look really cool. Jenny did a great job on them. Were they fun making, Jenny?
They were very fun, and thank you very much. I think they came out very good.
Yeah, they get really good. They're very high quality shirts. Jenny and I wear our own shirts at certain times when we're trying to put a spotlight on ourselves, and you can put a spotlight on yourselves. If you go ahead and pick up one of these shirts today, you guys are going to love them. Links in the description, www.zazzle.com at 13 o'clock.
Yeah, so go check out our store at www.zazzle.com/13 o'clock. We got these 4 cool new t-shirt designs, plus all our old ones if you'd rather get one of the old ones. But these ones are awesome, and you should check them out.
They're also available in women's cut, and they look really cute. Jenny's got some.
So thank you. Go check them out. Okay, now that we're back from the break, we're going to get into premature burial. That's the first thing we're going to listen to. And we're going to talk about.
All right.
So the interesting thing about it, as I mentioned in the opening segment, it seems that the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, who were actually pretty, up on shit for the time, they did see that there was a possibility that you could be entombed alive or that you could be cremated alive. So they generally had a rule. I don't think it was over the whole, empire or anything like that, but they did have a general rule that bodies should be left out for up to 7 days, so you could ensure that the person was already dead, and it would prevent them being buried alive or burned alive, which seems like a pretty good option.
Yeah, I got something to say about this.
What's that?
Because talking to Dr. Price, something came to my mind. this whole idea of being buried alive in a tomb, okay, and then being found to be alive later, okay, is a trope that goes back to the Greek and Roman period. And that may have influenced Christianity later on with the idea that Jesus rose from the tomb, rose from the grave.
Yeah. Now,
evidently it was traced back to a story, and I don't remember the name of the story, but somebody could check it out. It was about a rich young girl who died on her wedding night and was buried. But it turned out she wasn't dead. She was in a coma. And when some pirates or thieves came to loot the tomb, they found that she was alive, and they took her. That's how I remembered it. And then her husband, or the guy who was betrothed to her, went out and rescued her and brought her back. And it was some kind of a Roman tale. And based on that tale, they think it became a trope, this buried alive thing.
Well, here's the thing. That is a very, very common urban legend. Most of the examples stem from about the 13th or 14th century. And it even has a name. It's called the Lady with the Ring. Mm-hmm. And it's usually a young girl, a young wealthy girl who has been buried alive that nobody knows about from, catalepsy or something like that.
This is mentioned in that? You already have that mentioned?
Yeah.
Oh, cool. All right. So I was right. Yeah, it reminded me of that story.
I don't know if it's that old, but it is a very, very common urban legend.
Okay.
And the reason they call it the Lady with the Ring is because the girl is saved by robbers going in. She's buried with a very expensive jeweled ring.
That's it.
They break into her tomb or her coffin, and they try to cut off her finger because they can't get the ring off, and that wakes her up.
Right.
And there's usually a kind of thing, too, where she crawls out of the grave. Sometimes the grave robber dies of fright.
Right.
That's a pretty common thing to happen in the story. And then usually she gets out of the grave and then walks back to her house. Sometimes it's as much as 10 miles, some of the stories, and goes back to her house and starts knocking on the door. And invariably, her husband or her family thinks she's a ghost and won't let her in.
Okay.
So that's a very, very
So there's
common.
A bunch of different variations
Oh, yeah,
of this
there's
tale.
tons of them.
Okay.
Like, it's got its own Wikipedia page.
And do they know
and
when this tale started? Is this a Roman story?
Not that I know of. Like
Okay.
I said, most of the examples of it are from the Middle Ages, and pretty much every European country has several versions.
Okay.
And some of them are even associated with actual people that lived. Whether or not that actually happened to them, they don't really think so. But like I said,
some mythicists think that the Jesus story was based on these old tales.
It may have been, sure.
Okay. That some of these tales go back into Roman Greek era.
The interesting thing, though, is that, like I said, the Greeks and Romans seem to have taken precautions against premature burial. But then, when the Middle Ages came along, it seemed like, from records that still exist, it doesn't seem like during the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, that it was really a fear that a lot of people had, even though during the plague years, it was probably pretty fucking common.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing, normally, under normal circumstances, your family member would die. Sometimes you would leave them in the house, they would have a funeral or a wake, or it would be a few days before they were buried. And particularly, in the Jewish tradition, you had to wait 3 days before you buried them. So the problem being that when the Black Death started spreading out, or plagues and stuff like that, they didn't want to leave the bodies hanging around in the houses, because of fear of contagion and whatnot. And there were so many deaths that I'm sure it's inevitable that many people were probably buried alive. Because you know what I mean? It's, the guys would come by in the carts, like, bring out your dead, just like in the fucking Monty Python movie. And, and they'd be like, here, just take them. They died of the plague, overnight. Just take them and put them on the cart. There are some stories, possibly true, possibly not, about people waking up in the death carts, or waking up because at that point they would bury them in communal pits, because there was no way that you could bury them all individually or have funerals or anything like that, because there was just too many of them.
Yeah. I remember hearing stuff, it was based upon evidently things that were written down at the time, that there were, in certain places, in certain times, the plague was so bad that whole areas of a city and whole towns would be wiped out.
Oh, yeah.
People would go there and they go, where is everybody? And you'd open the doors and there'd just be whole rotten families died months ago. The whole town wiped out.
Yeah.
And then they just go, and the solution that the only thing they could do is basically, I guess they probably looted it, you know, and then burned it down to the ground. They'd even bury those people.
Yeah, I'm sure they probably did. Because like I said,
there was none of manpower to bury them all.
Yeah, it's impractical.
Right.
And like I said, even the ones that they did bury, they just had these huge communal pits like outside of the town, and they would just put them out there on carts and just dump them in there. They didn't have coffins or anything like that. They were just buried in shrouds.
Yeah, it'd be easier just to go house for house burning it down.
Yeah. And like I said, I mean, across Europe, what was it, like the Black Death? That was like a third of the population of Europe. Like,
could you imagine that? Just a whole town, you lose contact with it?
Yeah, that's
during the plague, and then you go there maybe months later and you find out that a whole town of thousands of people just gone.
Yeah.
Ghost town.
That's it. Yeah.
And they're all up indoors in bed, dead.
Yeah.
Imagine you're like the last of your family. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And everybody in the damn house is dead, and you're too weak to throw them out.
Oh, man.
Imagine you're like a little kid.
Yeah, and I'm sure that had to have happened. That had to have happened. I mean,
and everybody in the house is dead, and everybody on the entire block is dead. If they had blocks, but you know, probably mostly. Yeah, I guess they would have blocks in the downtown area. Everybody dead. It would seem like the apocalypse.
Every day, I am
why they were
so glad that I was not born in the Middle Ages.
That's why they thought it was God's wrath and all that, because from their point of view, it would have seemed like the end of the world.
If I had to live in some past, like a long time ago, I would rather go back to like ancient Greece. I would not live in the Middle Ages. No fucking way. Because like so much, so much progress had been lost like during the Middle Ages, it seemed like. So like I said, during the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, even though it was probably pretty fucking likely that some people, probably a lot of people, got buried alive because of the plagues and, the fast way that they disposed of everyone, it doesn't seem like it was that much of a fear. Ironically, what made it kind of a terrifying proposition all of a sudden, starting in about the 16th, 17th centuries, particularly in Europe, was actually the Enlightenment, and the kind of progress that was made in scientific and anatomical type of studies. Now, it came to light, I mean, before it seemed like life and death had been a pretty black and white proposition, right? You were either dead or you were alive. But then, as, medical knowledge progressed, they discovered CPR, and particularly people who had drowned and were underwater for a very long time and then were revived. And stories of this type, there was one guy, I think he was called the submarine farmer, which I kind of love. I don't know if this is a true story, but it was something that was like kind of gained urban legend status around Europe. And he was this farmer, and he'd been working, he fell through the ice of a pond, and he was evidently under there for 16 hours into the very cold water. And he was later pulled out and revived. Yeah. So people were kind of like, well, shit. That means that you would think that they were dead, right? But they weren't. They brought them back.
Right. There was one recent, I think, in Japan. Didn't some girl? She I don't know if it was some kind of drugs or something, but she fell unconscious outside. It was real cold. They think that she was out there dead for 20-something hours, maybe.
Yeah.
And this is just from memory. Somebody might be able to correct me. And then evidently they took her to the hospital, and they just started pumping oxygen into her and gave her some kind of blood transfusion. And she was a dead body, evidently. Yeah. And she revived.
Yeah.
That's weird.
It does happen.
And evidently it changed like a lot of definition of what death would be.
Yeah.
Like, wait a minute, hold on, this person was dead.
Yeah.
There, and a blood transfusion and then pumping oxygen. And it went on. They did that to her for a long time. So we're talking, it was more than 24 hours.
Yeah.
That she had so evidently been dead. That's weird.
But like I said,
we got to do a show on that. See if that's true. Maybe that's not true.
Usually, I have heard of people being revived in recent times, particularly if they have been out in the cold, because that will kind of suppress your metabolism.
Right, you won't rot.
To an extent where, so they can actually bring you back. And you see underwater, buried under snow, things like that. I have heard of that happening. I'm sure it's pretty rare, fairly, but that's essentially the same thing that happened about this time around the Enlightenment. And now there was a book written by this guy named Winslow, and evidently, according to him, when he was younger, he suffered from some type of illness that put him into some kind of catalepsy or narcolepsy or something like that, which would put him into these sort of trances. And he evidently was twice mistaken for dead and, was saved from the grave at the last moment because he woke up. So it was something that he was really interested in and also terrified of. Now, he wrote this book that was called something like The Uncertainty of Signs of Life. And it was it made a huge impact in Europe. It was translated into like 5 or 6 different languages. Like everyone read it. It was like a huge bestseller, especially after like a different guy who was more of a salesman. He had written some translations of it and went around like doing talks about it and stuff. So the whole basis of this book was that all of the shit that they had used previously to make sure somebody was really dead before burying them, which usually was like they'd put, a mirror under your nose, or they'd put a feather under your nose to see if you were still breathing, or, things like that. He's arguing that these are not sufficient.
That is not enough, right.
And he and the other guy that had picked up his work and translated into several other languages, that guy was so into this guy's theory and this guy's ideas that he went back through history and found every single story he could find about people being buried alive, whether they were true or not. He didn't really care. It was kind of like a polemic because he was trying to, get his point across. Yeah. So he gathered pretty much every story and he put them together. It was, like I said, a huge success, very widely read. Every educated person in Europe pretty much read this fucking book. And this book, combined with the invention of CPR, which at that time was kind of like a bellows, where they would kind of put it, they'd take out a drowned person and they would put this bellows and artificially inflate your lungs and people would revive. So people started, educated people started freaking out because they're sitting there thinking, well, shit, if there's no easy way to tell that a person is dead, or if you can bring back a person that you thought was dead and has been laying there for hours, then you could get buried alive.
Yeah.
It was the next logical assumption. So at this point, like during this time period, particularly in Germany, it seems like it really took off in Germany, but pretty much all over Europe. So there was this huge debate about how do we determine these people are already dead? How do we determine that all of these people have not been buried alive? And how do we prevent it from happening? I mean, you had like international competitions with cash prizes where they would where like doctors and lay people and everybody would try to come up with solutions to keep people from getting buried alive. Like what could they do to ensure that this person was really dead? And I mean, they came up with some crazy shit. It's like normally they would do stuff like, they put pins under their fingernails or toenails.
See if that
they would cut their veins to see if they bled. They would do, one very popular one was a tobacco enema, where they would blow tobacco smoke up your ass.
Damn.
They would take a sharpened pencil and stick it up your nose really fast. They'd put bugs in your ears. They would stick a red hot poker up your ass.
Damn.
They would cut your feet with a razor, like the bottom of your feet with a razor, because, I mean, the horror of being buried alive was so, became such a big, like, sensation. It's funny because in the book that I mentioned before, which is called Buried Alive by Jan Bondesen, he said they actually did a study of wills, of people like making things in their wills where they're like, make sure I'm dead before I get buried because I don't want to get buried alive. Because a lot of people thought, that's like a fate worse than death, right? Now, he said before this particular book came out, he found like 2 wills where people were like, we might want to leave my body above ground for a few days until I start to rot before you bury me, just in case. He's like, after that book came out and the years after that book came out, like the percentage of wills that had things like that, like please cut my head off or something like that, just to ensure, because some people were just like fucking horrified by the idea.
Yeah.
Now, the thing is, they're not really sure, like I said, I'm sure it happens a lot more often during times of plague, during times of war, when there's not a lot of time to attend to each body individually. But some of the stories that were put forward to kind of scare people at the time were probably just cases of, because a lot of times they'd be like, oh, well, we were digging up a cemetery like to move bodies or something like that, and people were found like turned over, or, you know, in weird positions, like their skeleton was in weird positions, or there were scratches on the underside of the lid, which in some ways could be explained by just the natural
gas bloating,
right? Because they're like, you know, when you put a body in a coffin, your abdominal, you know, gases start to expand, and there are cases of bodies straight up exploding. Sometimes the coffins collapse underneath the weight of the dirt, which will, you know, kind of rearrange the body parts. So they're like, just, you know, just the fact that the body's in a different position than when you buried it,
and you can
doesn't necessarily mean.
You can find this on the internet too.
Yeah.
Yeah, they'll actually, there's videos where people have opened up old coffins.
Yeah.
And what you find in there is pretty damn bizarre. Like a guy in an old Victorian suit, and he's just green with mold, but he looks pretty intact for as old as that body is.
Yeah.
It's damn creepy. And then the stuff in the inside of the coffin, you know, all the little like silk lining and everything is all kind of faded and rotten looking, and it's pretty damn spooky.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think like the ones where people were buried, and like I said, I'm sure it happens. It might not have been as prevalent as people were afraid of, but I think the more, not so much coffins, but I think people that were buried in vaults or tombs, there were a couple of pretty well documented cases of, you know, they would bury someone in a tomb, like generally above ground, like a mausoleum. And then later, you know, years later, they would come back to put another body from the family into the mausoleum, and the skeleton of the person would be right by the door.
Yeah.
And then there'd be like scratches on the door, which obviously that person, that poor person.
If that actually happened.
If that actually happened. Like I said, there are a couple of documented cases. Yeah. And like I said, that's kind of a thing that happens with a lot of these. Like I said, I'm sure it's happened. It had to have
had to happen at least once.
Because, well, they know that it's happened a few times. They're like, not so much because we found bodies in weird positions and stuff, but because of a few times when they had near misses. Right. Where somebody woke up in their coffin before they buried it. You know what I mean? They were putting it in the ground, and people were like, hey, I'm still alive in here.
Yeah,
you know, like they happened to wake up. So they're like, you know, had that person been buried, obviously they would have gotten buried alive because they were still alive. So it does happen. And the creepy thing too is that you may think that this is something that doesn't really happen anymore now that we have embalming and all that other kind of stuff. But there are some pretty recent, there was actually a case.
Yeah, there's some run recent.
There was a case that happened in the early 2000s, I think, 2002, I want to say. It was in Massachusetts. Now they were not buried alive, but they did wake up inside of a body bag.
Yeah. I thought there was one that just happened a few weeks back where
there was a couple in Greece.
Somebody
that
jumped
happened.
up out of the morgue, and it was an old lady.
Oh yeah, it might have been.
Yeah, that was a couple weeks back.
I was actually watching a documentary about premature burial. It was a British documentary from several years ago, and there was this poor woman on there, and she had narcoleptic catalepsy. And she periodically would pass out and go in, and for all intents and purposes would appear dead. She was actually almost buried alive 3 times.
Damn.
The first time of which happens when she was a teenager. It was in 1958, and she had gone to the movies by herself to see an Abbott and Costello movie. And apparently she was laughing so hard, I don't know if that's what triggered it or not, but she didn't know she had this affliction. And so she passed out in the back row of the movie theater, and then one of the ushers found her, and they couldn't find any signs of life. Yeah. So they put her in the morgue, and she woke up in the fucking morgue.
Yeah.
And the second time it happened, she woke up in the morgue, and the morgue door was locked. So she's like in there with all these dead bodies, like banging on the fucking door. I'm like, oh my God.
Well, I imagine after it happened once, she would kind of used to the possibility that she might wake up in a morgue or something every now and then.
Yeah, she seemed like kind of used to it. She was
again.
Yeah, she was an older lady, so she seemed not okay with it, obviously, but it did happen to her 3 times. 2 times in the UK, and then later on she moved to Australia, and it happened then. The sad time with that, she actually collapsed in the street. And the ambulance came to get her, and her son was nearby, luckily, but her son was only 15, and he came running up going, no, seriously, she's really not dead. She has this thing, and he couldn't remember what it's called, and shit like that. And of course, the ambulance men were just like, whatever, kid.
Yeah,
they just thought that he was being hysterical because that was his mom, and she's not really dead, she's not really dead. But then, they got her back to the... He was just trying to get them to like poke her or something like that, because if they put her in the cold storage, she would die, because it was Australia. It's really hot there. So their cold storage is like super, super cold. So they would have put her in the freezer and she would have died in there. But yeah, so as I said, so after all, red hot pokers up the ass, all this other like sneezing powder, all this other kind of stuff. And then some enterprising people started building things called safety coffins. And these were wonderful devices. Yeah. There were actually a lot of patents for these.
Yeah, I saw some.
In Europe and in the U.S., there were some patents for these too. How popular they were, some people did buy them. It never became super widespread.
Some of the stuff wouldn't have worked.
No.
Yeah. I mean, there was one that I saw where it's a coffin, and it's going to have a long tube like a pipe.
A lot of them had that.
That went up to the surface.
Yeah.
All right, and it was kind of a small diameter tube.
Yeah.
I challenge you to try to breathe through a small diameter. The idea was that
if
you were to wake
up,
you could. It was still the same as no air, because what ends up happening. The idea was that if you woke up, you would have a breathing tube to the surface.
Right. Yeah.
But the problem is you're talking about a tube, 7-8 feet long.
Yeah.
Try to breathe through a 7 or 8 foot long. That tube gets filled with nothing but bad air. You don't have enough lung capacity to pull fresh air into it.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
That's true.
So you would slowly die anyway. You would slowly asphyxiate through that little thing.
Because here's a happy fact. If you are actually buried alive in a coffin, you only have about half an hour of air. Yeah. Because half an hour, maybe an hour. If you don't panic. Which, good luck with that.
Yeah. You try to struggle and fight your way to the surface and break it open. Because that's what I would do. I'd try to kick the lid and crack it and dig my way out. It doesn't really work that way. It's too much.
No, there's too much pressure on top of it. I mean, like I said, the dirt will sometimes collapse the coffins, and it's happened to magicians.
It happens to magicians. I was going to say you can see that on video where magicians in that damn.
A couple
coffin,
of them have died doing that.
And they're burying as soon as it's buried, and they're going, and they go, oh, it's good, and all of a sudden the ground just goes.
Yep.
And they're like, hurry, get him. They can never get to the guy in time because it's hundreds of pounds of dirt lands on your lungs. You can't breathe.
You don't have much time. And that's you have a couple of minutes tops if that happens to you.
Yeah, and they were trying to get to him in the backhoe, but he was dead by the time they got to him.
Yep. But so all of these safety coffins, like I said, I love all the, because you can go, if you Google safety coffin, and there's all kind of like the drawings from the fucking, from the patent stuff. And it's like, they were so fun. Like one of them had an ejector seat, which I love. I don't think they made any of those, but someone patented.
How did that work?
I don't know.
It blows you out. It blows you out of the dirt. Yeah.
I love it. So most of them, like you said, had kind of a tube leading up to the surface. Yeah. Some of them were rigged with bells, electric bells, little flags, little lights. Later on, as time went on, they had little electric bells. They had one that looked like a kind of a little mailbox that had like a little red flag on it that would come up and shit like that. Now,
kind of like you wake up in the middle of the night and hit that flag, and you're like, yeah, they'll be here any minute. Yeah, sure, they'll be there.
Yeah, see, that was one of the problems, and why
you're in the cemetery. There's nobody out there.
Safety coffins never took off. Yeah. They said, look, we'd have to hire somebody to watch the whole cemetery all the time, just in case, like one of these alarms went off. Another problem too was that.
False alarms.
Yeah, well, because people are like, well, they have to be easy to do because, if a person wakes up, they're going to be panicking or they're going to be weak or whatever. So they have to be able to pull the alarm. So a lot of times they would tie the bells to their hands or their feet or whatever. But the problem is when putrefaction begins, the body starts moving around and, the alarms would go off, but the person was really dead. It was just gases moving the body around. So, so they were too sensitive. And like I said,
I remember there was one of them that had like a shaft above where the face would be. And it had a bunch of reflective mirrors. So the person could see out and you could see the person.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know if that was something that was ever made. It was just something they were showing on paper.
Yeah.
Just ridiculous shit.
I've heard of...
Because it was like a 1 foot square channel to the face of the person. How do you have a sealed coffin? It doesn't work. It wouldn't work.
No.
It wouldn't work.
Well, and that was...
Things would go down there and get the body.
That's actually one of the things that some people proposed. It's like, well, maybe we should make the coffins out of glass, or we should bury them like up above the ground, and then like, you know, this was mostly in vaults and stuff.
Yeah.
Now, one of the most famous, and like I said, going back to the original book, The Uncertainty of the Signs of Life, what his thing was he thought that every country in Europe, that they should build a series of what, in Germany at least, they called waiting mortuaries.
Yeah.
Which would be a building where they would put the bodies and they would just let them lay there, and most of them were heated, so the bodies would rot faster.
Yeah.
And then these bodies would also just be laying out in the open, like on little slabs, and they would also have them hooked up to various bells and alarm systems, so just in case anybody woke up.
Right. Yeah.
Now, for whatever reason,
because the dude starts rotting, you know he's not coming back. So you just let him out there and you go, yeah, he's stinking, bury him.
Well, and that's what Winslow was proposing. He's like, he's like, pretty much the only absolutely certain like way to know that a person is dead is when they start decomposing. So he's like, so obviously we can't do this quick burial type of shit. We have to leave these people out until they start rotting. Yeah. Now, he got, a lot of people liked that idea. In practice, really the only country that really took it under advisement was Germany. Now, they built a shit ton of waiting mortuaries all over the cities.
Because a lot of people die each day, and then you have to keep them out for about a week. So that's a lot of dead bodies out on the surface.
Yeah. But even in Germany, where a lot of them were built, and some of them were actually very nice. Some of them still stand. Obviously, they're not waiting mortuaries anymore. They've been, transferred, made into other things. But they built the first one was in Weimar, I believe, and then they had a whole bunch of other ones. And the sad thing, and this has to be one of the shittiest jobs ever. Normally, I mean, depending on how many corpse chambers these places had, they would have like 2 guys that worked like 12-hour shifts, right? And they could see into they had like windows, they could see into all the corpse chambers. Some of them had like a whole ward where all the, corpses were in one room. Some of them had like little individual chambers. So this guy who was working there couldn't leave the building for the whole 12 hours. He had to sit in this one place. Actually, most of the places, they said they didn't even have chairs because they didn't want him sitting down and falling asleep or anything like that. So they just had to stand in this fucking thing and just watching these fucking bodies. And they're like, and the problem is,
watching those bodies rot.
Watching bodies rot. And,
well, labor was cheap back then.
There was a lot of controversy, like I said. Germany built a lot of them. I believe they might have built one in France. But it wasn't like, people thought it was a good idea, but then they're like, where are we going to put these? They stink.
Yeah.
Some people thought that it was, not real dignified. And even though, like, even in parts of Germany where they passed a law that you had to take the body to the waiting mortuary, a lot of families wouldn't do it just because they said, I don't want my relative, like, just lying there rotting on a slab. It's like, it's not very...
It's better to get them down underneath the ground as quick as possible.
Yeah,
it's a lot more sanitary too.
Well, yeah, and a lot of people thought that too. They thought because
vectors, you got flies come in and land on the body, and then they leave, and then they go somewhere else, and then it lands on your food.
Yeah.
So you
and plus at that time too, they had the whole concept of miasma, where like they thought that bad smells in the air
smells might make you sick.
Were making you sick. Yeah. So there was a lot of controversy, and that's why waiting mortuaries didn't really take off anywhere other than Germany. But as I said, and then. So that was like a big thing for a couple hundred years, with the whole thing of like waiting mortuaries, with all this stuff in the wills about like, please cut my head off so I don't get buried alive or whatever.
Yeah.
Really, that went on until probably the advent of, what do you call it? Shit.
Embalming?
Yeah.
Embalming.
Yeah. The advent of embalming, which was somewhere around the Civil War, when they embalmed them to ship the bodies.
You can't survive that.
Right. So that actually made people,
probably made people feel better.
It did. And it's counterintuitive because you just think, well, I don't really want that to happen, like if you're still alive, because people were also worried about being dissected when they were still alive,
If you were unconscious, like in some kind of a coma, and you got embalmed, you wouldn't even know it.
No, you probably wouldn't.
You wouldn't know that you were dead.
Yeah.
You wouldn't know that you were dead.
So that's why, fear of being buried alive, it's a horrible thing to happen. And like I said, I can imagine like waking up in a fucking coffin, and that'd be like the worst thing ever. But, if you go through the regular funerary process nowadays, there's no way that you're going to be, I mean, unless you're in some country that doesn't embalm people, or unless you die in some fucking podunk somewhere in the country, it's like, if you get embalmed, you're not going to be alive when they put you in the ground, so don't worry about it. But, you know, it's just funny because, like I said, this book, Buried Alive, goes into the whole history and like this whole, it was just a whole movement, and there was just all kinds of like books and treatises being written about the best way to determine whether someone's still alive and try to keep people from forgetting. It was like something that a lot of people were like activists about because they wanted to save people from that horrible fate. And it was just like this really interesting part of history that I feel like isn't really talked about all that much.
I don't really understand really the fascination with trying to preserve the corpse and bury it and put. You know, I've seen lots of dead bodies. I've been to funerals and looked at open casket funerals. Not me, man. When I die, burn me up. Put me in a little vase.
Yeah.
Or something, or don't even do that, because when you get it, it's like in a little VHS box. Really, what it looks like.
Yeah, it does.
Dump that thing out in the water somewhere.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Because I don't even want any kind of. Having seen bodies, I don't want mine just sitting there like that, man. It's undignified, actually.
It is kind of. I kind of feel like the same.
I don't want any kind of physical remains.
Honestly, I would either like to be cremated or
just cremated,
or I would like to be. I would like to donate my body to science.
Because I've already had an out of body experience, and it's funny, the body's not you. When you're dead, you're not in there. That's not you anymore. That's
right. It's just a husk.
It's a discarded shell, and I don't want people looking at that thinking that that's me.
Yeah.
Before it goes into the ground and I got put in the ground. No.
Yeah, that's a little upset. Well, hey there, Cookie. What you doing back there? Look, she wants to be on the show.
Yeah.
What you doing back there?
She was laying on her back on the ground with her feet up like that. She sleeps on her back. The only cat I've seen.
She does, like a little person with her little back legs
spread out. She sees us do it, so she does it.
I guess so. She's the weirdest cat I've ever owned. Like weird in a good way. You know?
Yeah.
Well, so since we were talking about embalming, and I talked a little bit about dissection, because not only was there a fear that you would be buried alive, but also that you would get dissected alive, because that might happen too. Because, like I said, there are some diseases that mimic death, and so. And when actually I forgot to mention too that another thing that kind of contributed to the whole "oh my God, I'm going to get buried alive" thing was the invention of the stethoscope. That was also another factor that played into it. But so let's talk a little bit about body snatching.
Oh, yeah.
Now, here is an interesting topic because on the surface, it seems like a pretty horrible. It seems like a pretty horrible thing, but it kind of had a silver lining because
in advancements in science.
Yeah, it really advanced our understanding
Saved
of anatomy.
a lot of lives.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So as yucky as it seems, and as horrifying as it seems, and I'm not justifying Burke and Hare because they were murderers, but I'm just talking about people who took dead bodies and sold them to medical schools. Maybe not the most honest profession, but it probably helped mankind.
Yeah, well,
in a large way.
At that time, there were a lot of Western traditions, kind of linked in with religions that prevented the medical industry or the medical community from getting their hands on bodies.
Yeah.
And you needed to get your hands on these bodies to get any kind of experience, to create surgeons and to understand how the human body worked. I mean, It kind of goes without saying. But a lot of countries kind of banned messing with bodies because they thought it was kind of against God type of deal.
Well,
So there was this underground trade where you had doctors buying bodies that had been exhumed by body snatchers. There was good money in it.
It was.
Yeah, and
easy money, it should be said.
Yeah, and it gave money to guys who maybe didn't have any other kind of skills. You go out there and steal bodies and sell them. It was kind of an underground economy. Just because something's illegal doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong. There's a lot of stuff that's illegal.
And I feel like a lot of doctors and surgeons at the time really benefited from this sort of underground illegal trade.
I kind of think the educated elite
they let it slide.
Approved of body snatching
because they understood how important it was.
They knew that in the big picture that it had to happen. They were basically trying to keep the church happy.
Yeah, and I think that was kind of the problem.
Yeah.
Now, the thing about it is that continental Europe seemed kind of ahead of the UK and the American colonies at this stage, because they actually had laws where, it was, if you had, criminals, orphans, otherwise unclaimed bodies, then those were allowed to be dissected. They didn't have a problem with that.
Yeah.
Now, in the UK, they had a law, and I believe it was Henry VIII that passed this law, where the surgeon schools would only get 4 bodies a year, and that was and they had to be executed criminals.
Yeah, and that's not enough.
Those were the only, right. So what they ended up having to do is the surgeon schools, they would get this one body, one of their ones for the year, and then you would have to buy tickets to this huge, everybody's sitting in these big, huge theaters and watch them be dissected. So, and a lot of these, it was the public, but it was also medical students. Now, prior to, the Anatomy Act, which I think was 1832, somewhere around there, you actually didn't really need a license to practice medicine, really. And a lot of people that were operating on people had never cut open a body. They had never really touched a human body or done anything to them.
It made sense, though. These were the pioneers.
Yeah.
There was no authorities to go to when it came to anatomy. So you had to do it yourself, and you had to just share the knowledge with some guys in a theater.
Yeah.
Like, wow, look at that.
So that's what
that's what lungs look like. Wow.
They had books and stuff,
they had books on
of people that had cut up, but still.
But you have to do it that way. That was basically how aviation started too. It was a bunch of rich guys trying to figure out how to get an airplane to fly.
Yeah.
Well, who are they going to go? They're going to go to the FAA to see if you don't have a pilot's license. What are you talking about? There are no pilots. There are no airplanes. There was no FAA. There was no pilot's license. Anybody could make an airplane and anybody could fly it.
Yeah.
If you could figure out the same thing.
So what ended up happening in the UK was that a lot of surgeons, they were stymied by this body limit. Yeah. They're like, obviously this isn't enough. So what a couple of surgeons did was they started their own private medical school, and they started paying body snatchers to go and get fresh corpses from. Now, it should be noted that at the time, stealing a body was technically not illegal. Now, messing with a grave was kind of illegal, but it was just a misdemeanor.
Right.
Ironically, you could steal a body because it didn't belong to anyone anymore. However, it was considered theft if you took the burial shroud or any of the person's stuff that was in the coffin with them.
So you wanted to undress them when you were taking them out.
So they're like, so what they would do was they would take all their clothes off and they would take all their jewelry off and put it back in the coffin and in the shroud or whatever, because they'd get in trouble for that, but not for taking the body. Now, what they would get in trouble for mostly is because obviously the relatives of the people didn't like it. So sometimes, if there was a cemetery and people heard about, body snatchers going and stealing bodies from a particular cemetery, sometimes the relatives would stake out the graves or whatever, especially if it was new. And sometimes, if you had the money, they would do a waiting mortuary thing like in miniature, where they would have a little stone house and they would put the body in there till it started to rot. And then they would bury it so that it wouldn't be of any use. Now, it should be noted that when this private medical thing happened and all these other surgeons started getting in on it, then body snatching, almost overnight, became a hugely lucrative business to get into, because technically you weren't going to get hanged for it,
right?
Like you would for breaking into people's houses or anything like that. Yeah. It wasn't really a serious penalty, and because the demand was so high, bodies would bring a lot of money. You could get $200, the equivalent of $200 per body. And really it was just a night's work. You would just kind of dig, you'd get your crew and you'd dig down and you'd, take them out of the thing.
It evidently had some kind of a mystique and a mojo to it too, because doctors and university students also would become body snatchers.
Yeah.
They'd work alongside them, so they would kind of
That actually happened more in the U.S. Than in the U.K. because in the U.S., in the colonial period and a little, more. What am I thinking of? I don't know. I don't know what I'm trying to say. But a little after that is what the word I was trying to think of. The medical students were actually expected to provide their own cadaver for dissection. No, so the teachers wouldn't say, "Hey, go steal a body," but they'd be like, BYOC, bring your own cadaver. You know what I mean? So it's like wink, wink. You know what I mean? So they would kind of go and steal bodies. So same kind of thing. That was always more prevalent in the United States at the time.
I've seen photographs from that era too here in the. I think there might have been photos of here in the United States, but they'd have them. They'd have all their cadavers lined up on these little racks, and they're cut into pieces, and they got basically it looks like butcher's aprons on.
Yeah.
To the doctors, they're smiling with body parts, So I imagine it was kind of like a hardcore brotherhood back in those days. They're going out stealing bodies and having a good time and drinking and chasing women.
Yeah, I'm sure you know how crazy medical students.
Yeah. But doctors, well, doctors are nuts. If you know any doctors, a lot of doctors are nuts.
Yeah, they are. Yeah. I know. But yeah, so like I said, the body snatching became a huge thing. Now, as the time went on, it became kind of a big problem, and people were getting offended and shit like that. So, at that point, they start expanding the laws. Then they made it illegal to take bodies and all this other kind of shit. Now, let's talk a little bit about Burke and Hare, because they are probably the most famous body snatchers. Or they started out as body snatchers.
Oh, I know.
And then they decided, William Burke and William Hare.
Yeah.
Now, how they got their start, this happened kind of organically. This was in Edinburgh. And the two guys, they actually befriended each other. They lived on the same street. One of them ran a boarding house with his mistress. Now, while they were running this boarding house, they had this elderly tenant who died of natural causes, still owing them £4 in back rent.
There you go.
So at this point, they consult with each other, and they're like, well, let's go sell the body to the anatomist, and we'll recoup the money.
Right.
So they ended up doing that. And then a little while later, they had another tenant who was sick and dying. And then they figured, well, maybe we should just hurry this along. They didn't want to wait for him to die.
Yeah.
So they just smothered him.
Yeah.
And sold it again. And like I said, they were making a lot of money. So they're like, cha-ching.
Right.
So they're like, well, now we shouldn't wait for elderly people. We'll just snatch people off the street. Or what they would normally do is they would go to prostitutes or poor people or whatever, and they would go, hey, come back to our boarding house and we'll give you a drink or whatever. And then they would ply them with drink, and then they would smother them. They would usually put their hand over their face there until they suffocated, because then that way it wouldn't mess the body up and you couldn't really tell.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, in adjusted dollars, a cadaver from that era was going for the equivalent of $5,000 to $10,000. It wasn't real short money. It was pretty good money from what I remember.
Yeah, I don't know if it was that much, but it was quite a bit.
Okay.
It was quite a bit.
So I remember it was in the hundreds, and in those days that would have been in the thousands of dollars.
Yeah, it was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so Burke and Hare, like I said, they kind of started getting to a point where they would sell all of their cadavers to a guy named Dr. Robert Knox. Now, it's not really known. I mean, I'm sure that Knox probably figured out that these people were killing people, but he's like, well, I'm getting all these super fresh bodies,
right,
and I do need them. So it's I feel like he probably didn't ask too many questions about where they got them from. So Burke and Hare actually ended up, their problem was they started getting greedy, and they actually ended up killing a prostitute and kind of like a mentally challenged kind of guy he was like a street performer. And he was very popular. A lot of people knew him. He was called Daft Jamie. And when he turned up on a slab and was being dissected, a lot of medical students recognized him.
Damn.
Plus he had a club foot, so he kind of stood out. And also when they did some of the prostitutes, a lot of the medical students were like, hey, I know her.
Yeah. Where was this again?
This was in Edinburgh, Scotland.
Okay, yeah.
So
I think these guys were operating in the underground, weren't they?
Yeah.
The city at one point got so filthy that they had to kind of make a new false road, and you could go underneath there. And they had all these
vaults,
Yeah, and they had all these underground.
I was going to do a show about that actually.
Right, and there was a bunch of organized crime in there, and I know that based on a program that I saw, there was a lot of body snatching going on and selling dead cadavers. Going out of Edinburgh.
Yeah.
And it was, gangsters killing each other, or killing their enemies. And then instead of wasting the body, they'd sell the body.
Well, yeah, why waste it? They're already dead. So, if you're going to kill them anyway, you might as well make some more money off them. Yeah. Which, like I said, I guess is what Burke and Hare kind of thought. Now, the interesting thing about Burke and Hare is that they eventually did get caught when two of their tenants, it was like a couple, they got suspicious and wondered where this one girl was that had been there earlier, and then she wasn't there anymore. And then when they came back and they looked under the bed, and the dead body was there. So the problem, though, was that when they were brought to trial, they were pretty much able to successfully argue that they couldn't prove murder because, like I said, they had suffocated them with their hands. So there wasn't really any sign that they had been murdered. So their defense was, oh, well, they just died of natural causes, and then we just sold them to the anatomist and blah, blah. But the problem was that one of the was it Burke or Hare? I can't remember. But one of them turned on the other one, basically turned state's evidence and told them everything about it. So one of them got off scot-free. I believe it was Hare. Now, he just took off out of the country. They don't even know what happened to him. Burke was hanged. They actually think they killed 16, 17 people. I believe he was only convicted of 3. The ones that were recognized, the prostitute, Daft Jamie, and one other person. But so he was hanged, and the judge basically said, not only are you going to be hanged, but you're going to be publicly dissected.
Damn.
And then put on display in the medical museum.
Damn.
So they publicly dissected him.
Yeah.
Different sources say between 25,000 and 100,000 people came out to watch him getting dissected.
Damn.
And there were near riots because they didn't have enough tickets. They didn't have enough room for everybody because everybody wanted to come see it. So everybody cheered and everything. And they actually ended up putting his skeleton on display in the Edinburgh Medical College, where it is still stands to this day.
Yeah.
So you can actually go. And also they made a death mask of him, which is also still there, and they bound a book in his skin.
Damn.
That is also there. So that's how mad they were at him. Damn. But the thing about the whole Burke and Hare thing, so between that trial and between there was also this really prevalent body snatching gang. As far as I know, they didn't kill anybody, but they were called the Crouch Gang. And they pretty much had a monopoly, in this one area of London. And they actually drove the prices way up. What they would do was that if there was another rival gang that was trying to, steal bodies in a particular cemetery, what they would do is they would break into that cemetery and they would fuck it all up. They would take all the bodies out and throw them on it and make them useless.
Right.
And then so watchmen would be posted at this particular. So then the other gang. So they pretty much just made a monopoly, which means that they could go to the surgeons and ask pretty much however much they wanted.
There was a lot of that kind of stuff going on. I mean, even H.H. Holmes was trying to get in on that.
Yeah, that's
Getting in on that skeleton money.
And the Crouch Gang, not only would they sell the bodies to the anatomists for dissection, but then after that, they would take the bones and have the bones articulated and sell them to medical schools. They would also sell the teeth to dentists to make dentures out of. So they pretty much used every part of the body, every part of the human body. They were just wringing every cent they could out of every single body. Wow. So between Burke and Hare and the Crouch Gang, finally, in the I believe it was 1832, they passed the Anatomy Act, which basically, caught them up with the rest of Europe, where they just said, your family can donate your body to science. If someone dies and they're unclaimed, then they can be donated to science, and whatever. So it wasn't just a case of executed criminals, or you only get 4 of them or whatever. So now there was a much larger supply.
Just goes to show you, legalization always results in decriminalization. The criminals don't want anything to do with it. That's what they need to do that with these drugs. Just legalize that. Legalize and control it, and the crime will leave.
Yeah, so essentially once the Anatomy Act was passed, there was no longer a market anymore. So because they could get all the bodies they needed, so the body snatching kind of just, it disappeared overnight because, they didn't need it anymore.
Just think about, what a hotbed that old situation was to promote things like murder, serial murder, and crime. But just, I mean, H.H. Holmes, a good example. And, these body stealing and body producing gangs. Why steal a dead body to sell it when you can just make a dead body and sell it?
And like I said, the fact that Burke and Hare are the only ones that kind of got caught or got famous for doing that kind of shit, I mean, I'm sure it was pretty widespread. Right. Because it's not much of a leap to think, hey, why don't I just find drunks or prostitutes or people no one would miss
And that was
and
back
kill
in
them and sell their bodies. It's like, it seems like a no-brainer.
And that was like back in the Oliver Twist days, man. Life was cheap, so
exactly. And like I said,
think of the good old days. It wasn't a good old, man. It was bad back then.
No, it was horrible.
It was bad, yeah.
Like I said, I wouldn't want to live anywhere
some
from the
out of
Middle
Mad
Ages
Max.
to the Victorian era.
Yeah.
No way. Just no fucking way.
Yeah.
That was just like a horrible. But yeah, so, and like I said, a similar kind of thing happened in the U.S. They were a little bit slower, but eventually got to the point where, they had a similar kind of rule where you could, voluntarily donate your body, or they, anyone that was unclaimed, they could use for medical schools and stuff like that. And what caused the U.S. one was all the what they called doctors' riots, where like I said, medical students would be stealing cadavers because they had to, because that was part of their curriculum. So they'd steal cadavers and cut them up, and then the residents would get. And normally, the sad thing too was that a lot of the bodies that they ended up stealing were slaves or freed slaves. So there was kind of a racial tension going on there too, particularly in New York, which at the time was about 15% black. So a lot of the bodies turned up being black people, and they got very, very upset about it. So there were riots. Relatives of the desecrated, the graves of people who desecrated would kind of storm the medical schools and beat up medical students and things like that for stealing bodies from their plots. So that was a similar thing. It took like a series of riots and stuff like that before a law was passed. And even then it was kind of spotty because, laws were only passed in particular states. Like at some point, I was watching a documentary earlier today where they were digging under a part of a medical college in Georgia, I think it was, and they found a shit ton of skeletons under there, and they were able to determine that these were all the anatomical specimens that had been stolen, because they determined that it was from that era, where they had this one particular slave he had been purchased in order to be a body snatcher. That was his job. And he was like a very famous body snatcher. And so they think that all of these bodies that were found underneath this college were from his era. So these were probably a lot of the bodies that he took that were cut up and done. They found them in a basement because they said, the bodies would be cut up or dissected, and then they would throw all the pieces down in the basement. So they found a shit ton of them under the school in Georgia, and that was several years ago. But so
they found a lot of weird stuff underneath universities and schools, old mummies.
Yeah, I guess so. But yeah, so all right. So I guess that'll do it for our our graveyards themed episode. This was actually kind of fun. This is a fun topic. And like I said, I've read a lot about this.
The topic bleeds into so many other topics.
It really does. It really does.
Because while this was going on, there also the Wild West was happening.
Yeah.
So, and there was a lot of stuff about, life was cheap out there too.
Yeah.
And they were doing weird medical stuff also, snake oil salesmen and just weird stuff.
But like I said, as gross as all the body snatching stuff is, I mean, I'm sure that was a big... And one point that was made on one of these documentaries was that back in the days when you could only use convicted criminals' bodies for dissection, they're like, now there was a law where if a woman was pregnant, like a female criminal, she couldn't be hanged. So they couldn't... So no doctors could cut up a pregnant woman because they didn't hang any pregnant women.
Right.
So they're like, if pregnant women hadn't been stolen from the graves that had died, then they wouldn't know anything about obstetrics or gynecology or anything like that. So in a way, like it's yucky and it's horrible, but it had a silver lining because it really did progress medical knowledge to a great degree.
It was a weird time. It was like cross between Mad Max and steampunk type stuff going on. It was weird.
Except not quite as fun as that sounds.
Yeah. An Oliver Twist.
With much more maggots and lice.
Yeah. I don't think I'd
food.
want to live in the city during that era anyway. I think I'd rather be out
probably
west.
much better out in the wilderness.
I'd rather be out in the
honestly.
wilderness, out in the west, somehow running around with Native Americans and trapping and trading fur. I could probably deal with that more than with that bad shit that was going on.
I don't blame you. Yeah, because just the cities were just so
nasty,
tightly packed and dirty and everything like that, so.
Just immoral and corrupt and a lot of murder going on and poverty and terrible conditions and No thanks.
Yeah.
I've seen photographs of it. And it's funny.
Yeah, I know.
Beautiful buildings and everything, and then you see
Yeah.
the people, and they're kind of spooky looking. You know what I mean? And you realize that
Please kill us.
the running water that they had there was infested with rotten eels in the pipes and just nastiness everywhere. No thanks.
Yeah.
Lots of diseases.
I don't think I'd want any part
No
of it.
electricity. Nah.
But yeah. Like I said, all right, so I guess we're going to wrap up this episode. Remember, if you enjoy the show, to like, share, subscribe, share it with all your friends, share on all your social media. It really does help us out a lot. If you'd like to financially support the show, you can go to our Patreon page, which is patreon.com/13o'clockpodcast. And or you can go to our blog, which is 13o'clockpodcast.wordpress.com, and there's a link in the sidebar to a PayPal account where you may give a one-time donation if you would like to do that. Also, check out our t-shirts and our tote bag on our Zazzle store, which is zazzle.com/13o'clock, and check out our last movie review. I think I forgot to mention it was Alien and Aliens.
Yeah.
That was our last one. Also, go to thegamecrafter.com and look up Giallo Games. I'll put a link in the description. And check out my latest game and the expansion pack, which is called A Crimson Drop on a Crystal Palette. And I think that'll do it for this episode.
That's a wrap.
And we will see you next time. Bye.
Burke and Hare were a terrible pair. Their deeds were beyond belief. They worked underground in Edinburgh town, the cruelest kind of thief. For they stole the life from the city's poor, the city's waifs and strays. Got them drunk, laid them on a bunk and smothered their lives away.